So the link between, I think, smartphones and kind of like the decline in creativity and imagination, I think is actually quite key. I don't think that many people have sussed it out. It's kind of like, if you look at your brain, it likes information. It likes nice, clean, contemporised bits of information that it can stir away neatly in the mind, so that you can then, should you need to, recall it at a later date. The issue is that, so 20 years ago you would, like, I remember like the magazines that you used to read used to have like little facts and statistics in them that were literally called pub ammo. So you would be able to go to the pub and recall this fact, recall this statistic, recall this bit of information and share it with people who may or may not find it interesting. And the idea was that you had that because you didn't have something like a smartphone. Now what would happen is that occasionally somebody would make some kind of outrageous claim in the pub and you'd be thinking, no, that's not right. No. And people would get into the most like banal kind of like arguments because they didn't have anything to check it against. They didn't have any way of checking whether what the person said was true or false. This is actually where the Guinness Book of World Records comes from, because they saw that people were getting into fights quite regularly over who held what record and what not. And so they produced the Guinness Book of World Records so that every pub could have one, so that in the event of two people fighting over something like that, they could then check it as a point of reference, and once they checked it as a point of reference, that's it, discussion over. But what would happen is that occasionally you get a question that doesn't have an answer to it, or one that you couldn't really kind of like look up. A perfect example of how we see this play out is in Shaun of the Dead. Like one long-running, the two long-running pub disputes is, firstly, does the gun over the bar work? And the second one is, can dogs look up? And they must have spent hours kind of like discussing and debating whether or not dogs can look up. They can, by the way. But this was it. It was like you would get your bravado from being able to think through why that was the case, like what the question was and what the answer to it was, because you didn't have the ability to instantly look it up on your phone. As soon as you have that ability, what then happens is that when the brain gets faced with an unanswered question, it instantly goes to try and work it out, because the brain doesn't like unanswered questions. So it'll try and work it out, and it'll try and think through what the answer to that question could be. In that kind of frame, what your brain has to do is it has to bring in two key factors, I suppose you could call them: imagination and creativity. So when you let your imagination run riot because you're trying to work out the answer to something, you think of all the different possibilities. It really makes the mind a truly open space. And then creativity, well, how do they get to that creative point? What is that point of creativity that the person or whatever the facts related to, that became the case? So you were constantly in a world without phones or the internet, you were constantly thinking what the potential answers to these questions could be, and that gave rise to a lot of imagination and a lot of creativity, a real kind of like a creative journey that people would go on. Nowadays your brain realizes that the answer is there, it's in the palm of your hand. All you've got to do is just press the button that says Google, or DuckDuckGo in my case, and then just look for the answer, and there it's going to come up, and that's it. And so you're not really having to engage the imagination part of your mind. You're not having to engage the creative part of your mind, because you don't need to. because the tool that you have in your hand has eradicated the need for you to do that. So because you don't need to do that, you don't. I see this like quite a lot. That people, even if they were to think of how to be, I had an ex-girlfriend once, and I was saying to her, you need to be a bit more imaginative, you need to be a bit more creative. As a scientist, you need to come up with new ways of doing things that somebody hasn't already thought of. Creativity, invention, development. And the first thing that she did was she reached for her phone and she typed in how to be creative. The kind of like the product of that, or the product going forward of that, is that we have it where that part of the mind has kind of like, well, I wouldn't say died a death, but certainly on its way out. The difference between leaders and those who aren't leaders is going to be the ones who still have that creative mood, who will try and work something out without being given the answer to it, or without knowing that the answer is there. And this is where we come on to AI, which I fear is going to do the same thing. But I don't think it's going to do it in terms of creativity. I think it's going to do it in terms of the way that we think. See, if you can have a computer think for you, to do that kind of like that mental legwork for you, you're not going to do it yourself. And the ability to do it yourself is what separates us from so many other animals. Is that we think for ourselves. We have to think for ourselves. Our process that goes on up here needs to be governed internally by us, not by something that goes on outside. And so in the same way that kind of like Google and search engines and smartphones have killed imagination and creativity, the real fear, I think, is that AI could kill our need to think for ourselves. And as soon as we stop thinking for ourselves, I think we're in big trouble. So I say, don't turn your life over to machines. Like, have a little bit of a break away from it. Give yourself a really difficult question to answer, and how you should try and answer it is by thinking to yourself, is by trying to come up with the answer yourself without Googling it. Have an unanswered question. Try and think of what the solution could potentially be and try and answer it yourself. And then if you try and answer it yourself, maybe you'll come up with the answer, maybe you won't. But at least you'll have that space in your mind where you have an unanswered question, which will give your brain room to develop things like creativity and imagination. And it all starts by putting down your phone.